Welcome to Pushback. I'm Aaron Maté, joined by Max Blumenthal, editor of the Grayzone, author of several books, including his latest, The Management of Savagery. We are talking now about Syria, a lot of developments, Max, just in the past week. You've just written a piece at the Grayzone looking at one irony of all this, which is that, you know, for so many years, we were told about these moderate rebels that the U.S. was arming as part of its proxy war in Syria. Your piece points out that a number of these militias linked to the Free Syrian Army, the same ones that that we were supposed to cheer for before and that the U.S. armed, are now being used by Turkey to commit atrocities against the Kurds.
I did write that, and you know, I want to just first comment on the kind of the reaction to this whole unfolding, which is that it may have shocked a lot of people, and Trump may have gone about it in an abrupt way. I don't exactly know what took place or what Trump's thinking was, but it was very clear that the countries involved in the Astana process, which is the real peace process surrounding Syria, Turkey, Iran, and Russia, were prepared for this moment. And I believe that the YPG leadership, which was rebranded by a U.S. general as the Syrian Democratic Forces, were prepared for it as well. Basically, it was inevitable, especially after the Turkish invasion of Afrin, another area with a large Kurdish population where Kurds were threatened with ethnic cleansing in northern Syria. This took place last year, that the YPG, who are constantly referred to as the Kurds, although Kurds live in many countries in that region, who are actually Syrian Kurds, we're going to have to strike a deal with the Syrian government that would guarantee their protection against Turkey in exchange for their autonomy. And that played out in very rapid fashion. And the meltdown that we're seeing across the board, I mean, we saw Pat Robertson melt down about it. And then you have all of these anarchists who fetishize Rojava freaking out about it. That reaction really speaks to this sense that U.S. troops were going to have to remain in northern Syria perpetually in order to serve as this kind of tripwire, where if Turkey invaded, the tripwire would go off and more U.S. troops would rush to protect the Kurds in that region. And the U.S. troops can't stay there forever. It's just inevitable. Look at what happened when Obama tried to pivot to Asia and troops were withdrawn from Iraq and Afghanistan because that's where the real imperial focus is. So it happened. It took place. And it led to a real mask-lifting moment, I would say, where Turkey used as its ground force, as it did in Afrin, repurposed Syrian rebels who were once known in Washington as moderate rebels, who were once toasted as freedom fighters, and they were known as the Turkish National Army. So what I did in this piece is just bring to light a report by a Turkish think tank called SETA, S-E-T-A, which has an office in Washington and has offices around the world, but is basically a pro-government Turkish think tank, outlining the composition of the Turkish so-called National Army, which is really a mercenary army. And it noted that 21 of the 28 militias involved and united under the banner of the Turkish flag and the Turkish National Army to serve as Turkish ground forces in this invasion, and to strike the Kurds with an iron fist, in their words. 21 of them had been previously supported by the Pentagon and the CIA. I think 18 supported by the CIA, 3 by the Pentagon. 14 of those factions received TOW missiles made by Raytheon, which are heavy weapons, anti-tank missiles. And they were basically the Free Syrian Army, which had been supported by the CIA. Not only that, but Salim Idris, who is the sort of so-called defense minister of the Syrian Provisional Government, which is as real as Juan Guaido's government in Venezuela. This is the figure who was initially appointed to lead the Free Syrian Army and who welcomed John McCain in 2013 when he made his notorious surprise visit to Syria, hoping to stir up a U.S. military intervention. And so the mask is lifted. Why? Because these Turkish mercenaries carried out heinous executions of Kurdish captives. They dragged a Kurdish female legislator from her car and executed her on the roadside. They filmed themselves executing 2 Kurdish captives who were not even fighters. And this was denounced not only by who's who in official Washington, but by Hillary Clinton, who presided over the Arm and Equip program. In fact, in 2012, Hillary Clinton went to Istanbul at a conference presided over and convened by the Turkish president Recep Erdogan, who everyone's calling this bad guy and calling for sanctions on, and called for aid to those very same groups, which were then rebels. So back then, when they were fighting our enemy in Damascus, the designated enemy, they were freedom fighters. Now that they're fighting another U.S. proxy, they are described as pirates and bandits by a U.S. official and as crazy and unreliable by another U.S. official to the Washington Post. The hypocrisy is staggering. And so far, I've seen no one besides maybe Tulsi Gabbard with any mainstream platform point out the fact that this is blowback.
You've been vocal on this issue for a long time, and you've been pointing out that these people who we were arming, who the U.S. was arming, were not brave freedom fighters, seeking to liberate all of Syria and bring peace and freedom, but in fact, what you call Wahhabi Contras. What is it like? What is it like now for you seeing that mask, as you say, come off?
Well, I mean, it's not like people are writing me to tell me that they're sorry and that I'm vindicated, but that's to be expected. And once I got my head together and decided I'm gonna try to take a closer look at the Syrian catastrophe, it became really clear to me that this was one of the greatest scandals of our times. That through Operation Timber Sycamore, $1 out of every $13 in the CIA's black budget was being spent on a multi-billion-dollar arm and equip program for, as you said, Wahhabi Contras, people who were taking over areas of Syria and imposing a harsh religious theocracy and seeking to transform a previously stable, secular, pluralistic country into what Libya now is, a country ruled over by hundreds of fanatical warlords. It would have been a catastrophe for the region. And so I decided I was going to take on some of the psyops being foisted on the American public. It's starting with the White Helmets. And since I mentioned the White Helmets, I'm pretty sure they're involved in this invasion of northern Syria. I know for a fact that they were involved in the invasion of Afrin, also in northern Syria, where many of the same atrocities took place. And they were actually denounced by local Kurds and even by some Turkish and Syrian groups that had traditionally been pro-opposition. The White Helmets have basically become mercenaries of the Turkish government. And in many ways, they always were Turkish proxies. That's where they were founded by a British military intelligence officer, James Le Mercier. So, you're right. As the price for doing that, I was smeared. I remember like 4 years ago after my piece on the White Helmets came out, this guy named Thanis Kanabanis, who is a journalist and a think tanker, predicted that my career would be over within 3 years and that we'd be reading some media blog about how I moved on to to wait tables or something. Well, that obviously didn't happen. No one remembers who he is, although he is the husband of the longtime New York Times correspondent who was covering Syria, Ann Barnard, who is a total propagandist for the opposition and basically for the State Department. But that shows you the level of vitriol that my journalism inspired. And now here we are 4 years later, and everything that I've been saying, everything that you've been saying, Aaron, is really revealed as the just undeniable truth. This should be a vindication, because what we saw take place this week in northern Syria at the hands of these groups, which are, referred to as Arab militias, was what they've been doing for years across Syria, beheading people, taking captives, targeting Syrians based on their sect and their religion, and killing them because they are not loyal to the Wahhabi strain of Sunni Islam, just carrying out sundry human rights, sundry atrocities across Syria. And nobody paid attention to it in Washington because they were being supported with billions of dollars. So this is a mask lifting moment. I don't know how much else there is to say, except that, I think there should be some display of embarrassment from the people who've been smearing us as Nazi propagandists for daring to talk about the real intentions of these groups that were leading what was supposed to be a Syrian revolution. I mean, there would have been no Syrian so-called uprising for the past few years without those 21 groups that are now part of the Syrian so-called national army.
There's a lot to say about how cynical this was and how much it destroyed this country and how much the country is now being tormented as it tries to rebuild, something you've talked about in the aftermath of your recent visit to Damascus. But I want to read you a quote just to illustrate for people that the truth was always out there. People like Max Blumenthal and Rania Khalek and Ben Norton and others were saying it. It was also sometimes allowed to appear in the mainstream media. And this is a quote that from an article that really changed my perspective, and I really finally got what was going on. It was from an article in the New York Times Magazine by veteran Middle East correspondent named Robert F. Worth. It's called Aleppo After the Fall. It appeared in the spring of 2017. And he's talking about a city in Syria called Latakia. And he says, in Latakia, some people told me their city might have been destroyed if not for the Russians. In the summer of 2015, the rebels were closing in on the Latakia city limits and mortars were falling downtown. If the rebels had captured the area where Alawites are the majority, a result would almost certainly have been sectarian mass murder.
Genocide.
Well, his words are sectarian mass murder, which is strong enough. Many people in the region, he goes on, would have blamed the U.S., which armed some of the rebels operating in the area. In this sense, the Russian intervention was a lucky thing for the Obama administration too, unquote. So that's Robert F. Worth writing in the New York Times. But this perspective, Max, was just not the dominant one that we were presented. And in fact, when you even look today at how the Obama administration is criticized among liberals and even some leftists, the criticism that you'll find, and this is a very popular view, is that the Obama administration's folly in Syria was that it did not intervene. It did not enforce Obama's so-called red lines. It did not impose no-fly zones. All of this overlooking the actual history, some of which you laid out, about the U.S. meanwhile arming and supporting these people who, in the words of Robert F. Worth, were poised to commit sectarian mass murder if they got their way.
Well, and Worth's what Worth reported there is what I found being in Syria, which is that anyone who was a member of a religious minority in Syria felt that they had been saved from imminent genocide and destruction by the intervention of Russia, Iran, and Hezbollah. And, we talked about it in a previous interview, going to this historic Christian and Muslim town of Malula, which had been in Syria, continuously inhabited since the 5th century, since the Byzantine period, and how the Syrian army and Hezbollah ousted al-Qaeda from that town after al-Qaeda had basically taken a dozen nuns captive and was holding the entire town hostage. And this is a group that believes that Christians, Alawites, Shiites are essentially the Antichrist. Not the Antichrist, but that they are kafir, that they should be killed. And so that's just the perspective that you get across Syria. And it's the perspective I also got from many Sunni people who suffered in areas that were controlled by these groups. And you're right, it's not the perspective that we got in Washington, or in the US. The perspective that we got was dictated to us by one of the most expensive and sophisticated information warfare operations ever conducted. And a large part of it was actually run out of Turkey through the White Helmets headquarters in Gaziantep and I think Istanbul. And, you know, the White Helmets were supported by the US government and the UK. They were not just rescuers, they were an influence operation. So, you know, we were lied to again, and the lie exploded in northern Syria this week through the atrocities committed by the same forces that had been attempting to carry out genocide across Syria, who had actually, when they took over Idlib in 2015, drove all of the Christians out, slaughtered all Druze people they found, or demanded that they convert, and then therefore dig up the graves of their relatives and rebury them according to strict Sunni Islamic ritual. This was the moment when Russia decided to intervene because the US had just shipped in hundreds of new TOW missile systems, which were allowing Jabhat al-Nusra and Jaish al-Fatah, which was this coalition of Islamist extremist armed forces, to start marching from Idlib towards the coast where Latakia and the Alawite heartland is. And it's the Alawites that they really hate the most. I mean, beyond Christians and Shiites, they really hate Alawites because they identify them with the Syrian government, but also because they see them as completely non-Muslim, as just complete rejectors. I don't know what would have happened if Russia hadn't intervened, but it stopped that onslaught, and it actually led to a gradual de-escalation of the war. It also led to the retaking of the city of Palmyra, where some of the most precious archaeological treasures exist in the world, where the chief archaeologist was lynched by ISIS. It had been taken over by ISIS, and the Roman era theater was being used as a site for public executions. It was thanks to Russian air power and the Syrian army that Palmyra was retaken. And when I think it was Mark Toner, the State Department spokesman, was asked by a reporter in 2015, this is a scene I recount in my book, The Management of Savagery, does the United States support the retaking of Palmyra by Russia and the Syrian government? He refused to answer the question. He could not answer the question. So that says it all to me. It says it all. The U.S. was not happy, actually, about the defeat of ISIS and Al-Qaeda and their rollback that began in 2015. It just wasn't supposed to happen that way.
As John Kerry even told a group of Syrian opposition activists, the U.S. was sitting back as it watched Daesh, ISIS, advance on Damascus. The implication being that the U.S. was prepared to see a possible ISIS takeover of Syria, if that meant Assad being overthrown, which was just a stunning admission by Kerry. So, Max, as we wrap,
and I would just mention that the White Helmets were nominated for a Nobel Prize again by a figure who's known as the Canadian Alan Dershowitz, Erwin Kotler, who's a major pro-Israel lawyer. And they are nominated as they apparently participate in another Turkish onslaught in northern Syria. And after they joined the ethnic cleansing of Afrin, and after years of them working as the ancillary civil society wing or civil rescue wing and information wing of Al-Qaeda and 31 flavors of Salafi jihadi militias. And that should be a scandal, but you still can't talk about that.
Max Blumenthal, editor of the Grayzone, author of The Management of Savagery. Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot, Aaron.